Welcome back to part 2 of this tutorial series, where we will be applying materials to our logo reveal animation. We're going to be using dynamic paint and some frame drivers to achieve what I hope is a convincing laser cutter animation. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, before we can actually start applying materials to some of our objects, we're going to need to do some basic setup for the paint maps. And we're going to use those for the outline around our cutouts and also for the trails that follow our cut tips around. But before we get to that, I need to correct something that I messed up in the last tutorial. So if we jump over to UV editing, I'm going to tab out of whatever that was that we were editing there and bring up the canvas again, tab into that, hit A to select everything, and you can see there's a giant hole in the middle of our UV layout. And the reason for that is when I was selecting the cut paths, I accidentally separated that whole center section, and now it's no longer part of that UV layout. So if I just go in and Alt-Shift-click around these center edges, if I just hit F, that will fill that in right where it needs to be. But this also brings up a good point. So if you do mess up your UV layouts, all you need to do is go back in here. You can select the canvas and Control-click, select all your cutouts, tab into those to edit mode, hit A, and you should be able to just UV project from view again and move these around so that everything will be lined up perfectly, which is going to be very important for the later steps when we actually do apply the materials. So I'm going to go back to our layout. We can get this set up for the dynamic paint. So let me select the canvas again. And we're going to go to our physics properties. I'm going to minimize this collision setup and add in this dynamic paint. So our canvas is obviously going to be our canvas for the dynamic paint. We're going to add a canvas down here. And we don't have nearly enough geometry for vertex painting, so we're going to use an image sequence for this. And for this resolution, when you're experimenting and testing things out, you might want to use a lower resolution. I'm going to jump straight to 2K resolution for the final setup. And this frame start, our cut sequence starts at frame 30. So I need at least one frame before that just to establish a blank canvas. And for this end frame, before we set that up, I want to jump down to this dry settings. Let's expand those. And I'm going to drop this from 500. We'll go down to 20. And what this is for the wet map. All it's saying is that it's going to take 20 frames for the paint to dry after the brush has left that section of the canvas. So with that in mind, we can go back up to our end frame. And our cut sequence ends at frame 330. We need at least 20 frames for everything to dry. So I'm actually going to go up to 355 to give us a little bit of extra space to make sure everything's dry. And then this sub-steps is another important setting. So what's going to happen is it's going to calculate the paint for every single frame of the animation. But because our cut tips are moving relatively fast, you're going to end up with big gaps in the paint. So this sub-step will calculate in between those frames, and I found that 5 sub-steps works pretty well for what we're doing. So now we'll look down here for initial color. We're going to set this color to black, so I'm just going to take this value and drop it to 0. And under our output settings, make sure we're using the UV map we set up. PNG should be fine for the output, and then make sure you click this wet maps because we need paint maps and wet maps for this. It should be good for the canvas. So let's jump to this cut tip, and that's what we're going to use for the brush. So set up dynamic paint on that, change this type to brush, add that, and we're going to use white for the brush. So bring the saturation down to 0 and the value up to 1. And next we're going to set up this alpha and wetness. So the wetness is obviously just how wet the brush is at a given time. The alpha is the actual paint that's being applied. So in order to set up the paint and wet maps correctly, we need the alpha and wetness to be 0 at frame 29 they'll jump to 1 at frame 30 and then be at 1 for the duration of the cut sequence, and then drop back down to 0. So let's go to frame 29. We'll drop our alpha and wetness both down to 0. Hit I to establish a keyframe, and then we'll jump forward 1 frame, bring these both back up, hit I again to establish another keyframe, and then we'll jump forward to frame 330 when our cut sequence ends. Give those both keyframes at 1, then go forward 1 more frame, drop these to 0, give them another keyframe, and now in order to copy these settings to the other cut tips, we can just Control-click all of those and then click the one we want to copy the settings from. And if we do Control-L, it'll bring up this link menu and we can just copy modifiers. Now that copies the modifiers over, but it doesn't copy any of the animation information. So to do that, I'm actually going to start by giving keyframes. Let's see, let's go back to frame 29. And I'm going to put keyframes for all of these for the alpha and wetness, 0 at frame 29. And then if I go down here to the graph editor, and let's bring this up, Control-click all of the cut tips. And if I go to our first cut tip, I can just hover over the graph area, hit Control-C, and then I can click on the paint alpha for cut tip 1, Control-V, then the wetness, and I can do that all the way down for the other cut tips. And now if I just do cut tip 3, you can see I actually have those keyframes in there correctly. So at this point, we should be ready to bake out our image sequence. So let's go back to our canvas, and down under the output, we can just hit this bake image sequence. And if you have the settings set up the way I do, it's probably going to take a little while. So I will let that bake and then we'll come back. So our paint maps have finished baking out. So if you're not sure where they went, you can just check this cache path down here and that'll tell you where they got saved to. I'm going to switch over to the shading workspace and change my render engine to cycles, move this to GPU compute, and I'm going to switch over to the rendered view. And it looks like we still have our canvas showing, so I'll hide that. Then I'm going to select my first cutout, give that a material. I'm going to rename this to metal, and then I'll select my other 2 cutouts, and I can Control-L, link materials. And let's bring this up, and then I'm going to bring in an image texture node, and we can just open up our paint map. So I'll select paint map 29, and then we can just scroll down to the end of our paint maps, shift click paint map 355, open all those, Control Shift click, and the first thing you'll notice is that we've got this repeated. So that's this setting here. You can use extend or clip. I've been using clip. It shouldn't matter though. Then I'm going to bring in a timeline down here so that you can see as we scrub through this that isn't actually updating. So that's just this auto refresh checkbox. So if I go back to frame 29, we expect our cut sequence to start, or our paint map sequence to start. You can see we're already well into that animation. So I'm going to change this start frame. We'll change that to frame 29. And get rid of our cut tips for now. So as we expect, at frame 29, we don't have any paint showing up. We jump to frame 30. That's when the paint starts showing. The problem is if we go back anywhere before frame 29, right now we don't have any data. So what we need to do is change this offset. We'll change that offset to 29. And now anything before frame 29 just uses frame 29. And then the problem with that is at frame 29, now we're actually on frame 30, so we just need to change the start frame to 30. And now 29 has no paint, and frame 30, that paint starts. Then we also need to go ahead to the end of our animation, where we see we bake those out to frame 355, and now at 356 we have the same problem where we have no data. So if we change this frame count from 327 back to 326, now everything after that will use the last frame of our animation. And you'll also notice right now our rigid body physics, that simulation isn't working. So if I go over to our scene properties, expand the rigid body world, and under this cache setting, we can just bake this out, and that'll only take a couple of seconds. So now our animation will actually play through. So, the last thing we can do, if you want to change this color space to non-color, because we're not actually going to use the color data for this. And then we can just use the same node. We'll Shift D, copy that down, and we'll use that for the wet maps. So click open again, and we will scroll down to the end of our paint maps and find wet map 29. Click on that one. Go down to wet map 355, shift click, and open all of those. Now all your settings should stay the same with the exception of these frame settings. So again, we'll just move our frame count down, move this offset up one, and then we can change this start frame to frame 30. And then we should be able to jump back to frame 30 and see that starting correctly and make sure that at the end of our sequence, everything looks fine. With those set up, we can start actually applying material to these. So the first thing I want to do is create a brushed metal look for our metal plates. So let's bring in, do a texture coordinate input. Go from this UV input, we'll take that to a noise texture. Control Shift click, and all we want is some streaks from this. So let's use a vector math node. Change this to multiply, and we'll need to start with 1 for x and y. But then if I crank x up a little bit, you can see we're starting to get those streaks. I'm going to bring this to 200, so we get pretty fine grain streaks for that brushed metal. And I'm going to bring this detail up to 6, and I think this roughness all the way up to 1. That will give us a really tight grain for that. I'm going to use this factor and just plug it straight into our base color. And then we can also take that factor. I'm going to go to a bump node. We'll go to the height. Plug that right into the normal on the principled BSDF. And then for this strength, I can drop that to 0.1, and this distance will be good at 0.03. And then I'm going to Control Shift click on the principled BSDF so we can take a look at what we've got. Change this all the way up to 1 on the metallic, and bring the roughness down. I'm going to go to 0.35. Now that should give you a pretty decent brushed metal look. So the next thing we're going to do, I'm going to bring all this back a little bit. I'm going to bring in a mix RGB. And we'll change this to darken. And I'll plug a color from that first paint map into the factor, and then we can just bring this value down and bring this down to something like 0.05. You can see that gives us that outline. And then I'm also going to use this same paint map. We're going to bring that to another bump node. Go down to the height. And I'm going to leave this strength as 1, distance as 1, and we're just going to plug this straight into the normal on our other bump node. And I want this to be inverted so that it actually brings that down instead of up. Now we can start looking at those tails behind our cut tips. Actually, while I'm thinking about it, let's bring our cut tip back. And I'll plug this straight into the emission strength. And then if I bring this emission color up, bring the value up, you can see those tails start to show up. I actually want those to be a bit brighter, so let's bring in a map range. And instead of going from 0 to 1, I'm going to change this to go up to 10. That should make those pretty bright. Then for the color on the emission, I want to go to a black body. We'll go to the temperature. And we can plug that into the emission color. And I wasn't really sure what laser cutters operate at, but I did look up welding, and apparently that operates around 6,000 degrees. But I did want to bring this to min. We'll bring that up to 1,000, just so we get less of that red. But you can see up at the front, right by the cut tip, you have that white hot glow. And the next thing I want to do, if you look from the top down, this tail on the cut tip looks really uniform, and I want to break that up just a little bit. Let's bring in another texture coordinate. And again, I'm going to take the UV to a noise texture. And then we can take the factor, we'll go to a subtract. I'm going to take these, control click on that connection and bring those over. And I'll just take this color to the subtract node. And you can see that's subtracting almost everything off of that right away. So let's bring in another map range. Plug that in here. And I don't want to subtract much. Let's do 0.05. And then I'm actually going to bring this up to 0.25. And it still looks pretty uniform back here, so let's change the scale on this. I'm going to bring this all the way up to 45 and bring the detail to 8 and increase the roughness. Let's do 0.9 for the roughness. Then you can see the back side of that tail looks pretty broken up. And then speaking of noise textures, I want to bring in one more. Because if you look really close at the outline here, you can tell that this is pixelated from our paint map. So let's bring in another texture coordinate. And again, we'll go UV to a noise texture. I'm going to take from this color, we're just going to go to a vector map, subtract, and we'll subtract 0.5 from everything. And then we can take this to a mix RGB. Want this to be the second color, and we'll just bring our UV straight across to the first color and change this from mix to add, and plug that into the vector. And we're going to use that for both of our image textures for the input. And then we can just take this factor way down. Let's do 0.01. You can see that's not doing much. So let's bring the scale up we'll go to 20 on the scale. Now you can see that's giving you a lot of very wavy lines there. Let's bring this detail up. We'll go to 8 on the detail and take the roughness all the way up. Now you can see if you zoom in pretty close to that, you're getting a very rough, jagged edge to that cut line. But if you go further out from the top down, it still looks pretty precise like a laser cutter should. Now the last thing that we're going to do for this material, if you look at the end of our animation at that last frame, so I'll go to the camera view, you can see we still have those cutouts way in the background. They never actually fade away. So we could change the cut plane or the clipping plane of the camera, but that would make those disappear pretty quickly at the end. So let's move this frame to 390. And I'm going to go from the front orthographic. We can find our cutout and bring in another texture coordinate. And we're going to use, for the object, our first cutout, which is the one that doesn't move. And then we'll take from this object coordinate, we'll go straight to a length, vector map length. And I'm going to take this to a less than, and then we can Control-Shift click on that. I just want to see where this cutout is at frame 390. So if we bring this up, yeah, so it's around 25. And if we go up to 30, that's completely past it. So between 25 and 30. So let's bring in, we'll do a mix shader. We'll plug that in. I'm going to get rid of this less than for now. And we can do a transparent BSDF. So I'll plug our principled BSDF into the shader there, plug the transparent in, and then I'm going to bring in a map range. We'll plug that into the value and plug that into the factor on that mix shader. And we said from 25 to 30. Although it looks like it's backwards right now. So let me switch this to min and to max. So now if we zoom out a little bit, you should be able to see as we move forward the rest of that time frame, or rest of the timeline, that should disappear. Let's go back to our camera view. And now you can see as we go through the end of that animation, our cutouts will just disappear. The next material we're going to work on is going to be the cut tip. I'm going to focus on the first one, zoom in on that, and you can see I forgot to shade these smooth. So I'm going to go through real quick, make those all shade smooth, and then I'm going to apply material to this, rename this to cut tip. Now I'm going to select all of these, do Control L and just link the materials. We're going to get rid of the principled BSDF and bring in an emission shader. Plug that into the surface. And I want to crank this up to 10 for the strength. And you could leave that as is, but it looks a little flat. Sorry, go back to the cut tip. So I'm actually going to add something to this. Let's add in a transparent BSDF and also a mix shader. Plug those in. And I actually learned this recently from a Ducky 3D tutorial. So if we bring in a layer weight, and I'm going to use the facing output. You can see it's just telling us this black is where the surface is facing directly at the camera, and this white towards the edge is where it's facing away from the camera. I'm going to bring that blend up to 0.95, and let's connect this to a subtract. I want to flip this to the other one and subtract that from 1. And if I connect this to the factor, now you can see it's just fading off to the edges. So you could achieve the same thing from a volume, but this is actually probably a lot less expensive to compute. Now, the next thing we want to deal with is if we go through our timeline. So our cut sequence starts at frame 30, but before that, we shouldn't have a cut tip because we're going to turn our lasers off too. So we can use this same mix shader, but we need to control whether this is on or off based on the timeline. So let's bring in a value input, and we'll just do hashtag frame for that value. And now that will be controlled by the timeline, by what frame we're on. So we want to do anything greater than frame 29. We want our cut tip to be on. And we also need it to turn off at the end. So we're going to do a less than. So anything less than frame 330, we want it to be on. So if we switch over to that and go to frame 330, it should turn off. And all we need to do is take these two and multiply them together. And then we're also going to need to multiply by this subtract. So we'll connect that up. And then if we connect our mix shader to the output again, we should see as we go through this, our cut tip will turn off at the end. And same thing at the beginning, it should just turn off when we go before frame 29. Let's move over to our spark, which we're actually going to use most of the same material information. So we'll change this to the cut tip material and then click on this to make it a new material. And we can change this name to spark. And I'm just going to connect up the emission shader, Control-Shift-Click, so that's on the output. And then I can get rid of the rest of this. And let's move forward in our timeline so that those sparks are showing up. And what we want to do is, as these sparks get older, they'll cool off. So as they age, we want to use a black body temperature to show them cooling. So let's bring in our black body temperature. And I'm going to go ahead and add in, we'll do a particle info node. And this will give us the age of our sparks. But I want that to go from 0 to 1. So what I'm going to do is just take this age and divide it by the lifetime. So now that should go from 0 to 1. And I'm just going to bring this to a map range. And similar to those tails that we've made behind our cut tips, just connect that up. So when our spark is brand new, so when its age is 0, we're going to bring that up to 6,000. And as it cools down, we're going to bring it down to 1,000. So now, if I zoom out a little bit more, you can see we've got some orange back here and then white hot closer to the cut tip where they're brand new. The last material we're going to work on is going to be the laser material. So let's go up here to our first laser, and similar to the cut tip, we're going to need to make sure we shade these smooth. And also I want to get rid of this shadow because a laser shouldn't be casting a shadow. So if I go over here to the object properties, under this visibility settings, we can just unclick this shadow. So I'm going to do that for all of my lasers. Right click, shade smooth, and unclick the shadow. And then we're actually going to reuse most of our cut tip material. So if I go to that first laser, we'll go to cut tip, make sure we're using a new material for this. And then I'll click through the rest of our lasers, Control L and link material. We're just going to make a couple of minor changes to this. So for the emission shader, I'm going to bring this down to a red color. And I actually want to bring this up to 50. And I also want to change, so if I go to the camera view, you can see these kind of fade out as they get to the bottom. So we're going to fix that by taking out this subtract node here, and we're going to replace that with a map range. We could just connect this spacing to the value and connect this result to that multiply. And again, we need to reverse this. So it's going to go from 1 to 0. And then I just want to set this from to min to a pretty low value. So we'll just do 0.01. And that way those lasers don't fade out as they get to the bottom. And that is actually all we're going to do for the lasers. If we go to pretty low angle, I actually do want to do one more thing, not for the laser material itself, but for the actual world texture. I'm going to bring the strength of this world down to, bring it to 0.2, just so it's pretty dark. And that's it for the materials on this project. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the final installment of this series where we will look at the camera animations as well as some compositing to really make the scene come alive. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.